Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Oriel College and the first of this four-part series on modern election fraud by the Pharos Foundation. Tonight's speaker is Mawrey KC, the UK's most senior and experienced election commissioner or judge. He was an Eldon scholar here at Oxford, and he was called to the bar in 1964 before taking silk in 1986. He has over 50 years' experience as a barrister at Henderson Chambers, where he specialises in commercial and local authority law, as well as election law. Since 1994, he has sat as a Deputy High Court Judge and Election Commissioner. Richard has been a tireless and often lonely campaigner against election fraud for decades, the nature and scale of which would, to quote Richard, disgrace a banana republic. Successive governments and many academics have done their best to downplay or ignore evidence of this fraud, while election law itself does not form a part of any major public law textbook or curriculum. We are privileged indeed then that Richard has agreed to give this series for us, which is the first ever public lectures on election fraud. And please join me in welcoming Richard Mawrey KC.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible at the back. If not, I have wasted my last 60 years at the bar. Thank you for turning up on a very cold evening. And my first lecture, as you will see, is how we got here, electoral law down to modern times. Now, rather curiously, I propose to start with our old friends Gilbert and Sullivan and trial by jury. Because at the beginning of trial by jury, the learned judge, this is W.S. Gilbert, so the word learned is in deep inverted commas. The learned judge says, "But firstly, if the time you'll not begrudge, I'll tell you how I came to be a judge." There is in fact some point in this story, so bear with me. As you heard, election judges are referred to as election commissioners. They always have been. Commissioner is an old word for a judge who is appointed on a one-off case. So even when the High Court is involved, the judge sits, or the judges sit, as a one-off case. And if it's a parliamentary election, commissioners are High Court judges. If it's any other sort of election, they are essentially senior barristers who are asked to sit. And they can say no if they want. So it's entirely voluntary. It's not like being a full-time pucker judge where you go where you're sent. And in the High Court, there is, under the statute, a rota of judges every year who are assigned to election business. They are called the rota judges. And they are the people who try the parliamentary cases, of which there are very few. However, the election commissioners further down the line, like myself, it's all much more informal. Administration of the election business is in the hands of the King's Bench Division of the High Court, and in particular the King's Bench Masters Department. The masters are the second tier of judges in the King's Bench Division. They handle the procedural matters and things like that. And they run the election courts, basically. And they, over the years, kept an informal roster of barristers who might be called on to do election work. Well, in the early 90s, I get a call from one of the then Queen's Bench masters, who, quite by chance, was a former member of my chambers and an old friend. And he says, "Richard, would you like to be on the roster for election commissioners?" I said, "I don't know anything about elections." And we said cheerfully, "Nobody does, except for a very small number of specialists, and they are all closely linked to the main political parties and therefore ineligible to sit as judges." So I said, "Fine," and I was put on the roster and heard nothing more for some time. A few years later, I was given a small election case involving personation, which I shall explain later, up in the north of England. It didn't last. It was compromised. The claim was withdrawn. That's fine. And then in the year 2000, the government in its wisdom, or Parliament in its wisdom, passes the Representation of the People Act 2000, which introduces postal voting on demand. Now, as was predicted by everybody, except of course the members of Parliament, this opened the floodgate to fraud. And it was simply a question of time before the first shoe dropped. Now, it actually dropped in 2004 in the Birmingham Council elections. 2 petitions were launched for 2 wards in Birmingham on the basis of massive voter fraud. That was the grounds of the petition. And so the King's Bench masters said, oh, well, let's look at the roster. And they looked at the roster and they found that, like Abu Ben Adam in the poem, my name led all the rest, largely because it was the only one left on the list. So they said, oh, would you like to do this? And I said, yes, thereby proving the old adage that a volunteer is someone who didn't listen to the question. And anyway, I did this. It was very long, very complicated. I flew it by the seat of my pants, largely. Happily, according to the Divisional Court, got it right. And at the end of a lengthy process, it really was a lengthy process, I delivered a long judgment, basically setting aside all the councillor elections before me, disqualifying them, as I have to do obligatorily, from basically any political life for a period of 5 years. And I did make an incautious remark about banana republics, which was much reported. Well, there was a certain amount of shock, horror, panic. Oh dear, is this going on? So Parliament then applies 2 very small pieces of legislative sticking plaster. And basically people like me said, let's wait for the second shoe to drop. And that dropped in Slough in 2007. And the Birmingham fraudsters had devised, we counted up at the end, 14 different forms of fraud. Slough, they thought up a 15th, very effective one, which I shall explain in a later lecture. But anyway, again, off I was sent to try Slough. And that again turned out to be bad electoral fraud, disqualify the councillor, set aside the election. So by 2008, I discovered, to my astonishment, that I had become the man who knows all about elections. Well, small field. And I chugged around the country doing various smallish electoral fraud cases until 2014, when, as it were, the big one came, and a petition was launched to unseat Lutfur Rahman, the mayor of Tower Hamlets. And basically the petition there alleged almost every offence in the Representation of the People Act. So it was the full Monty. And I regret to say that at the end again of a long trial, I found most of the charges had been proved, elections set aside, more shock horror, and Mr. Rahman put off the tracks for 5 years. At which point I then hit my own buffer in that I reached the obligatory retirement age for deputy judges, and I hung out my wig. Now, as I'm sure you're all terribly fascinated by what in Oxford I may call my cursus judicis, the point of the story, as I'm sure you've all spotted, is that this is an absolutely crazy way in which to try disputed elections. I mean, this is, however small a scale, it is a constitutional matter. These are elected councillors, handling, I might say, very large sums of money, much more than any MP. As Mayor of Tower Hamlets, Lutfur Rahman handled a very large budget, or as I found, mishandled, a very large budget indeed. So it's crazy. But you may say to yourself, well, that's pretty ad hoc, that's pretty shambolic, but surely the rest of electoral law purrs along like a top-of-the-range Rolls-Royce. If you thought that, I'm afraid you would be mistaken. It is a law of extreme complexity. Were you to, decide to look at the books, you could buy Parker's Law and Conduct of Elections, 3 volumes. These are loose leaf volumes, so you have to have updates every 4 months. which cost a fortune on top of what you're paying for it. Or you can do the full Monty of Schofield's election law. Alternatively, you may cross the channel and find that the entire French electoral code is 640 pages. You can get it for just under 16 euros. It's the size of a large airport paperback, blockbuster. Otherwise, you get all that. Now, how did we get there? And we got there because for some reason, we do not have a written constitution. We're very proud of that, but we don't have one. If you have one, of course, it sets out the rules for what Parliament consists of, who sits in Parliament, how you elect them, who does the electing, and so on and so forth. All nuts and bolts, boring stuff, but it's all there in the Constitution. Our Constitution is, of course, unwritten, so it's a rather difficult combination of the common law and piecemeal statutes. No attempt was made even to codify electoral law until 1929. That's quite a long time. And the problem with the common law is that you have to look at precedents and decide which precedents are applicable to the present case and which are not. And judge decides one thing, then goes to the Court of Appeal and they decide something else, and then goes to the House of Lords or Supreme Court, they decide a third thing. And the problem with common law is the decision in a common law court is not, this is the law going forward, it's retrospective. It is, this is the law as it always has been since the origin of the common law, which, as I'm sure you know, was fixed in 1275 as being the 3rd of September 1189. Was fixed as the limit of human memory and therefore the limit of the common law. As it happens, it was the coronation of Richard Leonhardt. So this is the sort of problem that you face. Piecemeal statutes over the centuries, most of them disregarded, to be truthful. You pass them and say, oh, look, we're doing something about it, and then they are disregarded. It happens. Anyway, going back to Parliament, we all learnt at our mother's knee that parliaments were forced on King Henry III by Simon de Montfort, who was a serial rebel against Henry III until he was killed at the Battle of Evesham. And there were various sort of trial parliaments or, quasi-parliaments, including my favourite, which in 1254, which was called the Mad Parliament. Why, I can't remember. Anyway, in 1265, de Montfort forces the king to call a representative parliament with representatives of the counties and representatives of the boroughs. Clearly, it wasn't democratic, it wasn't elected, but it was representative. You had someone there who says, I am speaking on behalf of Yorkshire, or someone there saying, I am speaking on behalf of, let's say, Wallingford, Oxford, there. And the system sort of then chugs on with parliaments being called, they had to be called by the monarch. They weren't permanent. That comes later. They had to be called by the monarch, always when the monarch wanted money. So the monarch calls a parliament, says, vote me some money, and they say, it'll cost you. So he has to make concessions here and there, and the whole thing is very, coarse trading. Trump would have loved it. And, but there is no mechanism for changing it. So you have all these lovely boroughs which were thriving places in 1265, possibly even 1300. But time takes its toll of things. Populations move away. Wars occur. Big diseases like the Black Death occur. So that by the time you get to the 18th century, you have a large number of boroughs where there's only a handful of people, sometimes nobody living there at all. These are the famous pocket or rotten boroughs. And these returned people to Parliament because the landowner, in effect, owned the borough and owned the votes. So he, and it always was a he, would appoint to Parliament his own representative. And they tended to be slightly cynical about it. There were two rotten boroughs in particular that come to mind. One is Old Sarum, which is a deserted hill outside Salisbury. And this is Gatton, which another notorious rotten borough with, I think, probably only 3 or 4 electors, matters not, which is essentially owned by the owner of Gatton Park. And in order to cock a snook at people, he built this lovely little temple called Gatton Town Hall, which he built solely to hold the election for Gatton, which of course was a complete farce because the election was simply unopposed. And on the day, he stood up and said, right, you know, Mr. Jones, my nominee, is elected as a member for Gatton. And so proceed. Now, the rotten borough system, we think the rotten boroughs are virtually indefensible as an idea, though we're quite happy with the concept of safe seats where a small handful of people in a smoke-filled room in effect nominate the... But be that as it may. But at the time they were defended on 2 grounds. One, it was said that it enabled the patrons to appoint bright young men to Parliament who would not have got there because they didn't have the money or the connections. The second category of people were the eldest sons of peers who were sent into the House of Commons in order to get their eye in so that when they eventually went into the Lords they'd know how to legislate, and also peers who did not have a seat in the House of Lords, particularly Irish and Scottish peers. And so the rotten boroughs continued, but we'll see what happened to them. Now, elections up to the 19th century had various problems. The first and major one is voting in public. Elections are public acts. They occur in public. The voters cast their vote openly in public. They roll up and say to the returning officer, I am John Smith, I have a qualification to vote as such, and he says, who do you vote for? And a piece of paper is produced, and and it says Jack Jones or whatever it is, and he then the voter then signs, so everybody knows how you voted. That, of course, facilitates bribery, threats, treating, all the other corrupt practices. Because if you bribe someone to vote, you know whether he's taken the money and voted the right way. With a secret ballot as we have now, you pay him to vote, he could say, oh yes, of course I'm going to vote for you, and go and vote for that. You wouldn't know. But they would know there, and that was the key to electoral fraud. Elections lasted over many days. Quite understandable. If you were carrying out an election for Yorkshire, you'd probably have one returning officer in York, and everybody would have to get there and to cast their vote. Elections over many days lasted well into the 20th century. The first single-day election was 1924, and apart from 1945 and the service vote, they've been on a single day ever since. There was no register until 1832. There was no register of electors, so someone presented themselves to vote. They could be challenged there and then on the basis that they were not properly voting. There's an interesting case from 1759, which was in the Times the other day, that a black man living in London, running a shop in Fleet Street, went along to vote. And they said, oh, you can't vote. Not because he was black, but because they assumed that being black, he wasn't born in England. And he said indignantly, I was born in Bury St Edmunds. So he turned and said, right, fine enough for me, counts the vote. So there was no prejudice. On the other hand, if he'd come along and said, I identify as a woman, they probably would have said, no, sorry, they can't vote. Anyway, there's no register of electors, so there were a lot of grounds for challenging people. Oh, X voted when he wasn't entitled to do so. There was no mechanism for enforcement beyond election petitions, which were, of course, until, as you will hear, the 19th century, heard by Parliament and decided, of course, on political grounds. Malpractice widely committed. In addition to the rotten boroughs, many elections were uncontested. And they remained uncontested for a long time. There were quite a handful of uncontested seats as late as 1923-24. So there was legislation, it was piecemeal legislation, Corrupt Practices Act in 1695 and a Bribery Act in 1729, and these further at once in the 19th century. They were interesting. They were phrased as sort of cutting down on expenses, but if you actually read the small print, what they were doing was prohibiting not the candidates from bribing, oh no, they were prohibiting the electors from coming along and asking for bribes, because of course these MPs didn't want to find themselves in the shoot trade, and they thought, these wretched electors, they come along, they open their mouths too wide, they demand too much money, you know, and so they were penalised and they could be fined for selling their votes. Of course, nobody ever enforced that. No real record of any of it happening. So now may I come to what might be termed test case 1. In Sir John Soane's museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields, you will find 4 paintings by Hogarth, Humours of an Election, which exemplified in effect what was wrong with elections. This is called an election entertainment, and this exemplifies the corrupt practice of treating. Treating is basically feeding people with lots of food, drink, giving them entertainment, and they will all then vote for you, possibly still in a state of inebriation. And there they're having a wonderful time. The mayor is obviously on his 10th dozen, who is the chap in red on the right, who is obviously in the throes of the 10th dozen oysters, and everybody is eating and drinking and swilling, including the parson, and sort of naughty ladies chatting up men and so on and so forth. It's not a very edifying scene, but that is the entertainment. The second painting shows canvassing for votes, and you will see in the middle of that the chap in the very middle is being bribed. Whether he is actually being bribed for his vote or whether he is a publican being paid by the candidates to provide the entertainment for the voters, it's hard to say. There are, of course, more naughty ladies up on the top, enticing the gentleman in the buff coat, who is looking quite keen on the idea. So that is the canvassing for votes. But then we come to the poll. And here you have a beautiful rural scene with a nice bridge at the back, the kind we're familiar with in Oxford, and there's a sort of husting there. And there you have somebody who is clearly illiterate, having his hand held while he votes, and I think somebody is there objecting to his voting because he's illiterate. But my favourite is the man in the white cap to the left of the picture. Now, if you are charitable, he is, as we might say, in articulo mortis. I'm not charitable. My view is that he is actually dead, and he's going to cast his vote. He is, you know, as John Cleese would say, an ex-voter. Anyway, he is voting. And on the far left, you will see a very sad lady in a carriage which has broken down. That's Britannia. Anyway, the candidate wins and is chaired through the streets. On a chair, there you are, looking most insecure. The paintings are full of symbolism, but I could give an entire lecture on the paintings, but I'm not going to. And anyway, you know, the usual blind fiddler and so on and so forth. So he's won, and there's lots of violence. The pigs are, I think, meant to symbolise the Gadarene swine. Now, you may say to yourself, Hogarth, great artist, great satirist, but, you know, this is all over the top. I'm afraid it isn't. This was the Oxford county election for 1754. And there we have it. There were Tories versus Whigs. There were 2 viscounts and 2 baronets. One viscount was the eldest son of an earl, and the other one was an Irish peer. And the main plank of the Tories' platform was they wanted to put the clock back, literally. They wanted to repeal the Calendar New Style Act 1750, which is the one that changed the beginning of the year from the 25th of March to the 1st of January, and also aligned us with the Gregorian calendar they had on the continent, which meant that we lost 11 or 12 days, you can argue. But anyway, there were riots saying, give us back our 11 days. And there in 1752, you'll see the calendar moves from the 2nd to the 14th overnight. Back to this, happily the Whigs won the election, so that we didn't repeal the Act, and we are keep the 1st of January as the beginning of the year. Except for HMRC. HMRC is still on the Julian calendar, and it still starts the year on the 25th of March, though it is obliged, thanks to the Act, to call it the 6th of April. But it is still on the Julian. It's the only institution in the world that's still on the Julian calendar. The Tories were also the Tories were very anti-Semitic, I'm afraid. They wanted to repeal the Jewish Disabilities Act, which had actually taken disabilities away from Jews, not imposed them on Jews. Virtually everything you see in the Hogarth picture is absolutely slice of life. That's what happened. Except that the voting was not in this lovely rural setting with the bridge. It was here in Exeter College. Now, at the end of the poll, Tories come first and second. Oxford obviously votes to put the clock back. And the Whigs third and fourth. But the corruption and the shenanigans is so great that the returning officer, who is no fool, says, I'm going to return all 4 candidates as elected. So he returns all 4 candidates as elected, and as you see, there's a Whig majority in the House of Commons. When petition is heard or whether the problem is heard in the House of Commons, they say, oh no, the Whigs won that one, despite coming third and fourth in the poll. Just one more point on the Oxford election. The electors spent the sum of £20,000, which if you apply the ONS statistics, we are looking north of 5 million in modern money. Big potatoes. But case study number 2 is this splendid fellow, Thomas William Cook, known as Cook of Norfolk, very wealthy Norfolk landowner, built Holkham, and famous agricultural reformer. And here, as you see, was a Whig MP from 1776, Declaration of Independence, through to 1832, Great Reform Act. For years, Norfolk had had a very nice gentleman's agreement. It returned 2 members, so the Tories put up one, the Whigs put up another. They were both elected unopposed, no problem, no election, cost nothing. 1806, disaster strikes. A 3rd candidate appears. So there is an actual election. Now, Cook, not short of a bob or two, and he throws money at it. He throws £32,000 at it. Value of money has gone down. We're still talking, something like 4 million, something like that, at the election. And the other candidates throw in similar sums as well. And at the end of the election, Cook comes top of the poll. Great, elected. No. A petition is launched on the grounds that there was widespread bribery, and it goes before the committee of the House of Commons, and they say, yes, there was patently widespread bribery, but they were cunning enough not to say by whom. So they set the election aside, but left everybody free to stand again. Now, the sequel of it's actually quite funny. Thomas William Cook was furious. I'm a member of an Anyway, he gets in touch with his brother Edward, who's a county member for Derbyshire, and says, right, we're swapping seats. And Edward said, oh, yeah, all right. So he comes down south in order to contest the rerun of the Norfolk election, whereas Thomas William goes up and sits for Derbyshire. So when the rerun of the election comes in March of 1807, The gentleman's agreement has come back into force. Everybody has seen sense. They're not going to spend any more money on it. And Edward is returned unopposed for Norfolk, together with a Tory candidate. And, of course, Thomas William is up in Derbyshire. All, of course, completely futile, because 6 weeks later, Parliament is dissolved again, and there's another general election. And on this time, Thomas Williams come down, resumes his seat in Norfolk. Gentleman's agreement, no contest, and Edward goes up on the same basis to Derbyshire. Now, Thomas William Cook, having spent 32,000, was wont to remark in later years, another contested election like that and I'll be in the poorhouse. Of course, he wouldn't have been, but there we are. In the 1807 election, however, in Yorkshire, there was the county election. And in Oxfordshire's eligible voters were probably about 4,000 people. Yorkshire, big county, something like 25,000 people. It's still, the size of a very small constituency today. Anyway, that was the Yorkshire vote. The Yorkshire candidates threw no less than £200,000 at this election. We're talking between the 20 and 30 million in present day money. Now, it's easy to apply statistics. We extrapolate forward. But let me put some flesh on the bones. One of the most famous ships in Nelson's navy was HMS Indefatigable, which is a 74-gun ship of the line. It's a battleship. And it was responsible for lots of acts of daring do under Edward Pellew, who its captain, who appears very briefly in Hornblower, if you remember reading Hornblower, and later becomes an admiral, and indeed, as you see, Viscount Exmouth. HMS Indefatigable was built for £25,000. Fully equipped with guns, rigging and all this, that and the other, £35,000. So what the Yorkshire candidates spent on the 1807 election would have bought 8 ships of the line. Makes what Trump and Harris spent look like peanuts, doesn't it? You couldn't buy 8 aircraft carriers even for what they spent. And I'm bound to say, as a Lancastrian observing the folk of God's own county, I'm entitled to say a fool and his money are soon parted. Anyway, by the 1820s, it began to be apparent to everyone that the system could not continue, and reform was in the air. Reform on 2 levels. One, getting rid of rotten boroughs and giving the seats to the new large industrial cities, which were at that point still disenfranchised. A place like Manchester and so on didn't have any MPs, whereas the dear chap with the little house in Gatton did. So getting rid of rotten boroughs, redistribution was issue 1. Issue 2 was widening the franchise, which was then very narrow. Need again to go the great history of the Reform Act. Suffice it to say, it was fought tooth and nail. The Tories opposed it, the Liberals supported it, and eventually it was forced through by Earl Grey, after whom the tea is named, by the simple procedure of putting a pistol to William IV's head and saying, I want you to threaten to create enough Whig peers to get this through. And William said, all right. And he made the threat, whereupon the Tories said, perhaps we will let the Act go through. We don't have all these Whig hobbledehoys in the House of Lords. So it went through. And what the Reform Act did was this. It changed the existing qualification. In the counties, the qualification was that you had freehold land worth 40 shillings a year. And they looked and they said, oh, that's very precise. How did we come by that? They said, oh, there's an Act of Parliament. Oh, that's nice. And they looked at the Act of Parliament and they discovered it had been passed by the Parliament of Henry VI 400 years before in 1430 and hadn't been updated. So this is the 1432 figures. Each of the boroughs had there were at least 6 different systems for boroughs. They were completely bizarre. Anyway, they were all simplified. The electorate, as you see, was increased, not very high, just it was increased, and everybody thought, oh yes, this is real reform. As you 56 boroughs abolished, 31 reduced to 1 borough, 67 new constituencies, so Manchester got its MP, and register of votes was made compulsory and has remained with us ever since, under the registration officer for each constituency, each electoral district, I'm sorry. Famously, elections were confined to men. But if you actually look at it, this was simply custom prior to 1832, common law if you like, and there were very odd recorded cases of wealthy women being allowed to vote and their votes counting. But they were very, very rare, and nobody thought this was a precedent. 1832 Reform Act says voters male. It enfranchises only members of the male gender. So thereafter you have a century in which women fight for the vote, get it in 1918 partially, fully in 1928. Now, you'd have thought, well, reform, we're all going to be respectable now. Sadly not. In 1837, Charles Dickens published his only intentionally humorous novel, The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, Pickwick Papers. And aficionados of that work will know that at one point, Mr. Pickwick's solicitor, Mr. Perker, invites Mr. Pickwick and his chums Winkle, Snodgrass and Tupman to the town of Eatanswill. Nobody ever accused Dickens of subtle naming. Anyway, Mr. Perker in Eatanswill is the election agent of Mr. Samuel Slumpke, who is one of the two candidates in what is patently a by-election in Eatanswill. And he says, come down and watch the election. So Mr. Pickwick and his chums go down. And they discover that bribery and cheating are rife, violence is rife, noisy demonstrations, people threatening with clubs. The whole thing is completely over the top. And there we have them rioting on the left with poor Mr. Pickwick, who's a rather unworldly fellow, I think, looking on rather sadly and trying to fill a pipe, I think, with his chums behind him. At one point, Mr. Perker, who was high opinion of his opposite number, Mr. Fitzgibbon's agent, says, oh, a very sharp fellow. He's got 35 prime voters locked up in the Dog and Duck, and there's no good our getting at them because they'll all be as tight as owl by the time they get taken to the poll. But Mr. Perker knows one worth two of that. He invites all the wives of the Eatanswill prominenti to a tea party, at the end of which they are given as a party bag a parasol, costing 7 shillings and 6pence, my dear sir, which is obviously top of the range for parasols in 1837. And you think to yourself, again, like Hogarth, great author, it's satirical, it's over the top. Not a bit of it. In the autumn of 1836, Dickens was engaged by the editor of the Standard, not the Evening Standard, but the Standard was then a newspaper, to go down to Northamptonshire North constituency, where there was a by-election. The by-election being caused by the death of the incumbent Whig member, who you would not be surprised to learn is a Viscount, and the Tories were throwing everything at the end. They'd had a miserable time in 1832. They got clobbered. And now they were going to make a comeback. So they threw everything at the Northamptonshire election. Everything you see or read about in the Eatanswill election is absolute, again, it's slice of life. That's what Dickens, it's reportage. It's not fiction. And he reports the whole thing. The Tory candidate, a man called Counsel, was as mad as a bag of frogs and used to go around the constituency firing off pistols, threatened to pistol his opponent until they took the weapons off him. Sadly, he won. But anyway, after 2 days of all this hoo-ha, because again, election over many days, Dickens calls in his fellow correspondents, Times, Morning Post and so on, and says, look, boys, do we really want this? And they said, you know, Charlie, you're right. And so they hire a post-chaise and get the hell out of it back to London. So he only lasted 2 days, but that was enough to give him the material. Well, 1837, of course, saw the election of the good but not amused Victoria, and the attitudes changed. All the rumbustious squires and aristos of the 18th century were replaced by rather dour northern men who didn't think the thought was funny at all. So they begin to legislate. 1848, significant year, but they establish a committee of elections, rather like the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords that used to be our Court of Appeal. Corrupt Practices Act and the Corrupt Practices Prevention Act started to turn what were common law offences, bribery and treating and so on, into statutory offences, and it was a start. But now we come to 1867, where reform was proposed, curiously this time by the Conservatives, with the Liberals fighting it tooth and nail. And it was quite a bold reform being put forward by the government of Lord Derby, in which Disraeli was leader of the Commons. And even nervous Tories, like the future Marquis of Salisbury, called it a leap in the dark. And there we have Punch showing the leap in the dark with a horse with the face of Disraeli, with Britannia on the back, going into what is obviously a sort of Aintree-type fence. There was no need to get peers threatened by Queen Victoria, because, of course, the Tories had a majority in the Lords. So the Conservatives had a majority in the Lords. They were able to get it through. So the Act was passed. The main thing, more redistribution of seats. The main thing was it increased the electorate by almost 90%. Big increase. And but now we then come to the fateful year of 1868. It was the year in which Edison applied for his first patent. Interestingly, because you will see it was for an electric vote recorder. He got his patent, never caught on. But the government had moved from Derby, who had retired, and Disraeli became Prime Minister in his first administration. And his idea, backed up by his Lord Chancellor, Lord Cairns, was to transfer election cases from the Commons to the judges. And he proposed, Lord Cairns proposed, that the judges should handle election cases. Now, you will sometimes hear it said, oh, well, you know, unelected judges getting rid of democratically elected politicians. Though, of course, as you will have spotted, anyone who has been elected by cheating and breaking the rules has not been democratically elected. But it's sort of presented as if this is judicial overreach. The judges are muscling in on it. Not a bit of it. When it was proposed by Lord Cairns, the judges went ballistic. Sir Alexander Cockburn, who was the Chief Justice, ironically enough, one of the country's leading experts on electoral law, wrote an absolute stinker to Lord Cairns saying, this will not do, we do not want to do this, because we will be accused of bias, we will have parliamentary, of political partiality, and our reputation for impartiality as judges will be damaged. And Lord Cairns and Disraeli said, tough. If not you, who? And of course, the question basically answered itself. And it was forced through, much to Sir Alexander's horror. And there you see the judges are being forced by Constable Disraeli into dealing with bribers, and they don't want to do it. but he's told, you will. Now, fortunately for the judges, though not for Disraeli, at the election later in 1868, a government was returned under William Gladstone, his first and greatest administration from 1868 to 1874. It was arguably the most reforming government that we have ever had, even including the Liberal government of 1906 and the Attlee government of 1945. Gladstone's motto was, if it moves, reform it. And he did. He carried out root and branch reforms of the armed services, the civil service, the judicial system, the election system, and so on. Now, his reforms had two minor and one major effect on our subject. The first was that in 1872, the system of trying disputed elections was extended to local elections, and the system of trial by senior barrister was set up on exactly the same basis as trial of parliamentary. The second was that the Judicature Acts, for some reason that I have never understood, said that parliamentary elections would be tried by two judges and not by one, as they are to this day. No idea why. But the main change came in 1872, when into the Municipal Elections Act they slipped a small, clause. Nobody really noticed it. But when the smoke cleared, he had introduced the secret ballot. And again, Punch was rather in favour of that, and there you see a successful candidate introducing the secret ballot to a curtsying Britannia. Now, the secret ballot basically put the electoral malpractice folks out of business. Between 1872 and 1910, there were only something like 93 successful parliamentary petitions. When you consider you've got a House of Commons of well over 800 with the Irish members, you have not only lots and lots of general elections, you have lots and lots of by-elections. That is actually a very, very small number. And that was, that knocked the bottom out of it. But they had the bit between the teeth, and more changes came. The Corrupt and Legal Practices Prevention Act virtually codified the whole business of electoral corruption, and is the basis from which the law was taken in later codifications, to which were added some illegal practices in 1895, a lot of them concerned with illegal expenses. As you see, a franchise extended 1884, 1918, and 1928. It's codified for the first time in the Representation of the People Act 1929, and last time it was done was in 1983. And the 1983 Act will be the basis of my explanation of the modern law in the next lecture. Since 1983, the main changes have been the introduction of the postal voting on demand, which I said, and the Elections Act introduced ID at polling stations, which we all know about now, and redefined certain electoral offences. Again, I'll explain that when we come to deal with the Act. So, as that other Gilbert and Sullivan character said, Major General Stanley, my electoral law, though plucky and adventurous, has only been brought down to the beginning of the century, and I shall deal with the current law later in the series. Now, I wouldn't like you to leave this thinking that electoral malpractice was the prerogative of the British, that we were not, as dear Boris would say, world beaters. I don't think we were. Let me provide you an example. The patron saint of electoral malpractice is the 5th Vice President of the United States. When this gentleman was, in a previous incarnation, was governor of Massachusetts. And as such, he was responsible for settling the electoral boundaries, particularly in the city of Boston. And when the electoral map of Boston was drawn, it was discovered that there were a large number of districts with a very small population that just happened to vote for the governor's party, which weirdly was called the Democratic Republicans. And a very small number of very large districts which contained the renegades who would vote for the other side, the Federalists. And an enterprising journalist of the Boston Globe looked at the map and said, you know, it looks just like a lizard. And he coined a name that combined lizard with the name of the governor of Massachusetts. As we all know, the American for lizard is salamander, and the governor was none other than Vice President Elbridge Gerry. And what did they create? The gerrymander. And the gerrymander, which he got the Elkanah Tisdale, who was the sort of in-house cartoonist, the Boston Globe, Boston Gazette, I'm sorry, to draw the gerrymander. And the immortality, he was not otherwise a particularly distinguished vice president. He only lasted less than 2 years before the poor man died. But there you have the gerrymander. And from that day to this, Vice President Gerry is remembered for an electoral practice which has been practiced worldwide. So he is a world beater on that. Well, if you have been, thanks for listening.